The stove had been cold for 3 days. A freight teamster stood in the cabin doorway and ran his thumb along the crack in the firebox. His thumb fit inside it, and then he looked at the woodpile. There was no woodpile. There was hay rope and kindling sticks, and a 5-year-old boy on the bed whose breathing made a sound like a reed blown wrong. The teamster pulled on his gloves. He looked at the woman standing beside the bed, with her hands pressed together to stop the shaking. He said he was sorry about the math. Then he told her what the math was. Toluf Asen died in October, 3 miles west of Minakata Junction, when a wagon loaded with pine poles slid backward down a gulch and pinned him beneath the axle. Randy found him before the mule stopped braying. She buried him on the claim with Eli holding the shovel handle steady, and Pater pressed against her leg, coughing into the wind that never stopped crossing that stretch of Dakota territory that was 3 months ago. 3. Now it was January of 1888, and the last split log burned to ash before midnight. Randy fed the stove hay rope she had twisted that afternoon. The flame caught bright, flared against the cracked iron, and died inside 40 seconds. She twisted another length. Same result. Bright, hot, gone. Hay burned the way paper burned, fast and empty, leaving nothing for the hours between midnight and dawn. She twisted 6 more ropes and fed them one at a time, and by the 6th, her fingers were too stiff to grip the stems. Frost feathered the inside of the cabin roof by 4 in the morning. She could see it forming in the dark, a pale fur spreading across the boards Toluf had nailed 3 summers ago when the wood was green and the future was a word that meant something. Peter's breathing had changed. The dry rasp that lived in his chest since November now carried a whistle, thin and high, the sound a reed makes when a child blows across it wrong. Eli lay beside him with her coat over both their legs, awake, watching Randy with eyes that asked nothing because the girl already knew the answers. $9.20, half a sack of flour, beans enough for 6 meals if she kept the portions honest. 1 milk cow gone dry and worth nothing until spring grass came. If spring grass came, if the cows survived that long on twisted hay and bark strips. No seasoned firewood, no neighbors within shouting distance, no family anywhere in Dakota territory. No fare east even if she wanted to run, and she did not want to run because Toluf's grave was on this land and the Homestead Act said she had to live on and improve 160 acres for 5 years or lose it all. And she had already given 3 of those years, and the dead do not get refunds. The stove went cold. She pressed her palm against the iron and felt nothing, not even the memory of warmth. She walked to Minakata Junction that morning with Pater on her back and Eli gripping the tail of her coat. The settlement was not much. A store, a freight depot, a feed barn, and 6 houses strung along a rutted track where the black hills broke into rolling grass. Smoke rose from every chimney except Orendace's fuel shed, which did not need a chimney because Oren sold wood rather than burned it. Randy asked for credit. Orendace stood behind his counter with his thumbs hooked in his vest and his ledger open to a page that already had her name on it. He was 46, built like a nail keg, and he had been buying failed claims along the creek since 1884. He did not need to be cruel. He only needed to be patient. Failed homesteaders sold cheap, and winter made more failures than drought. He offered her green pine at $4 a half cord, payable with a lien on her cow, her stove, and her spring plow. Randy looked at the green pine stacked behind the shed. She could smell the sap from where she stood. Green pine hissed and smoked and threw sparks and gave back half the heat of seasoned wood, while filling a cabin with creosote that could burn a chimney down. $4 for a half quart of trouble. She said no. Oren leaned forward on the counter. He did not raise his voice. He rarely did. He said, "Mrs. Asen, You have no wood. You have no credit elsewhere. Your husband, God rest him, left no account here, and what he left on the claim would not heat a chicken coop past Tuesday. I am offering terms. Randy said, Your terms put a lien on my plow. Without the plow, I cannot break ground in spring. Without spring crop, I cannot eat. Without eating, I cannot hold the claim. Your terms end the same place as the cold, Mr. Dace. They just take longer. Orrin closed the ledger, not with anger, with the calm of a man who knew that arithmetic was on his side and patience cost him nothing. He said, Take your time, Mrs. Austin. The wood will be here. She walked out with Pater still on her back and Eli still holding her coat and $9.20 still in her pocket. The wind hit them in the face, crossing the open ground between the store and the road. Pater buried his head against her neck. Eli squinted and kept walking. That afternoon, Ezra Bellows came to the cabin. Ezra was 58, a former Army teamster who had freighted supplies across the plains in weather that killed horses standing up. He walked with the stiff care of a man whose joints remembered every blizzard. He had lost 2 toes to frostbite in 1872 and part of an ear to a windstorm near Fort Pierre that he never talked about. He was not unkind. He was simply honest in the way that honest men become when they have seen too many bodies carried out of sod houses in March. He did not knock. He pushed the door open. It had warped and no longer latched, and stood inside the cabin and looked at everything the way a man looks at a house he expects to be empty by spring. He touched the stove. Cold. He ran his hand along the crack in the firebox. His thumb fit inside it. He shook his head. He checked the chinking between the wall logs, gaps wide enough to slide a finger through on the south wall, gaps on the north wall where the mud had dried and crumbled in 3 places. Wind moved visibly through the south wall, carrying fine snow that dusted the floor near the children's bed. He crouched beside the woodpile. There was no woodpile. There was 1 armload of twisted hay rope and a few sticks of kindling Eli had gathered from under the porch. He picked up a hay twist and weighed it in his hand. It weighed nothing. He set it down. He looked at the roof. Snow load. He could see the boards bowing between the rafters. He said, How long since you burned real wood? Randy said, 3 days. Ezra stood and brushed his knees. He said, You need 6 cords of dry wood minimum to see the rest of winter. Tight chinking, top to bottom, both walls and the roof seams. A second quilt for each child. 1 neighbor within shouting distance, willing to check on you every second day. And you need that stove crack sealed with clay or riveted, because the next time you get a proper fire going, the crack opens wider and you get smoke in the room instead of heat. Randy said, I know what I need. Ezra said, Then you know you do not have it. He was not being cruel. He was reading the room the way he had once read prairie weather, looking for signs of what was coming and finding nothing good. He pulled on his gloves. He looked at Pater, who was sitting on the bed with his knees drawn up and his breath making the thin whistle that never stopped. He said, The boy needs a warm room, Mrs. Asen. Not a warm hour here and there when you burn grass. A warm room through the night, every night, until his chest clears. That means fire. Steady fire. The kind that needs wood you do not have and cannot buy. Randy said, I'm aware of my son's lungs. Ezra nodded. He was not going to argue with a mother about her own child, but he was going to say the thing he had come to say, and he said it at the door, with 1 hand on the frame and the cold pouring in behind him. Stone won't mother you, Mrs. Austin. A body lives by fire, or it does not live. He left the door ajar behind him, and the wind entered like it owned the place. Randy sat on the edge of the bed and did the math the way she did it every night, hoping the numbers would change, and every night they refused. 1/2 cord of dry wood, if she could find dry wood, which she could not, would last perhaps 4 days in hard cold if she burned carefully and kept the stove damped low. 6 cords would cost $24 at Oren's price, and she had $9.20 and needed flour before she needed warmth. The nearest deadfall timber was buried under drifts in a gulch 2 miles south, and dragging frozen logs without a horse or ox was work for a crew, not a woman with cracked hands and a 5-year-old who could not breathe properly when the temperature dropped. Hay Twists bought minutes, not hours, not nights. Minutes. She pressed her hands together until the shaking was only in her wrists. Eli watched her. Pater coughed. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Oren's freight wagon rattling back toward his fuel yard, loaded with green pine that someone else had bought on credit they could not afford. The cold was already inside the walls. It was inside the children's bed. It was inside Pater's chest. And every solution Randy could name required money or neighbors or time, and she had none. Where could heat come from if she had no fire? The gorge was a gash in the limestone hills 1/2 mile west of the cabin, narrow at the mouth and choked with scrub pine and ice-coated rock. Randy had avoided it since autumn because Tolliff had warned her about loose stone above the ledges. But the gorge had overhangs, and overhangs sometimes sheltered dead brush that the snow had not buried, and dead brush was fuel, even if it burned fast and thin. She left the children in the cabin, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and entered the gorge as the light was failing. The wind was worse inside. The walls funneled it, turned it sharp, gave it edges that found the gaps in her coat and the raw places on her knuckles. Her fingers stopped obeying after 20 minutes. She could close them, but could not feel what they held. She spotted a shelf of dead juniper under a rock ledge 10 feet above the gorge floor. Getting to it meant climbing frozen limestone on hands that had stopped reporting to her brain. She made it halfway before her boot slipped, and she slid down the face of the rock and landed hard on a flat shelf at the base. She lay still. Her hip ached. The cold pressed against her back through the stone. She could hear Pater's whistle in her memory, which was worse than hearing it in the cabin because here she was alone, and the sound meant she was running out of time in a way that had nothing to do with winter and everything to do with being a mother whose child could not breathe. She turned onto her side and saw the fissure. It was a crack in the limestone, jagged, roughly 30 inches wide at the mouth and 5 feet high at its tallest point. It ran back into the rock at an angle she could not see the end of. It looked like the kind of place a badger would use in winter, or a snake in summer, or nothing at all in between. She crawled in because the wind was killing her, and the fissure blocked the wind. At first she thought something was wrong with her body, because the air changed, and the change made no sense. Her cheeks stopped stinging. Her wet lashes softened. The roar of the gorge wind dropped to a hum, and then to silence, replaced by something else, a slow pulse, a pressure that moved through the stone like breathing. Not fast, not warm exactly, but different. The air inside the fissure was different from the air outside the way water from a deep well is different from water left standing in a bucket. It had weight. It had steadiness. It did not cut. She pressed her back against the inner wall and held still. Her hands began to ache, which meant blood was returning to her fingers. Aching was better than numbness. Aching meant alive. She stayed for 10 minutes, then 20. Then the air did not change. It did not get colder the way a sheltered spot gets colder once your body heat leaks away. It held. 50 degrees, maybe 55. She could not measure it, but she knew cold the way every woman who had spent 3 winters on the plains knew cold. And this was not cold. This was something that had decided its own temperature and was not interested in what January thought about it. She remembered her mother, not all at once. The memory came in pieces. the way memories do when the body is the thing that summons them. Her mother's hand on a cellar wall in Norway. The cellar had been cut into rock below the farmhouse, and in winter the turnips stored there never froze, and in summer the milk kept cool, and her mother had said a thing that Randy had filed away the way children file away everything adults say that does not seem urgent. Her mother had said, "Do not ask whether stone is warm, ask whether it changes slowly." And then another memory, sharper, her mother crouching in the cellar doorway with a candle held low, showing Randy how the flame leaned toward the crack where the wall met the floor. Flame bending toward a gap meant air was moving. Flame standing steady meant a person could breathe safely. Flame guttering blue and low meant bad air, meant leave, meant do not go deeper. Her mother had held the candle there until Randy could read the lean herself, until the girl understood that a candle was not just light, but language. The air in the fissure was moving. Randy could feel it against her face, a slow exhale from deeper in the rock. The earth was breathing out. She crawled deeper. The fissure widened after 8 feet into a throat, and beyond the throat the ceiling rose. She could not see in the dark, but she could feel the space open around her, the way sound changes when a room gets larger, the way her own breath stopped bouncing back at her and instead traveled outward. She reached up and touched nothing. She reached to both sides and touched stone on the left, but air on the right. The chamber beyond the throat was larger than the throat itself. She backed out carefully, feeling the walls with both hands, and emerged into the gorge wind like a woman surfacing from water. The cold hit her face and she gasped. The difference was that stark. 10 feet of rock, and the world changed completely. She walked home in the dark. She said nothing to Eli. She fed the children beans and 2 handfuls of flour cooked into flat bread on the cracked stove using the last kindling sticks. Pater ate half his portion and coughed the rest of the night. Randy lay awake and did new math. She could not buy 6 cords of wood. She could not burn hay fast enough to survive a week. She could not leave the claim without losing everything, and she could not stay in the cabin without fuel. Every conventional answer required money or neighbors or time, and she had none of these. But the fissure had steady air. The fissure had no wind. The fissure held a temperature that would not freeze water or children or lungs. If the air moved, it was breathable. If the chamber was large enough, it could hold 3 people and their bedding and their food. If she could seal the entrance and control the draft and keep water from pooling on the floor and leave a vent so the air did not turn foul, the fissure became a place where you did not need fire to survive. Not a home, a refuge, a place where the math worked without wood. The idea was either the best she had ever had or the kind of thought that comes to people right before they make the mistake that kills them. She could not tell which. She suspected Ezra Bellows would say the second. She suspected Orrin Dace would smile. She went back the next morning with a candle stub and a length of rope tied around her waist. Eli held the other end outside the fissure, under strict instructions to pull hard if Randy shouted or if the rope went slack for more than a slow count of 30. The candle confirmed everything. The flame leaned outward at the throat, air moving from inside the rock toward the surface. Steady lean, yellow gold, no guttering, no blue tinge at the base. Breathable air, moving air, pressure-driven air pushing gently from the depths toward the sky. The same physics her mother had shown her in a Norwegian cellar, scaled up and buried deeper. She crawled through the throat and into the chamber. It was 12 feet long, 8 feet wide. The ceiling rose high enough for her to stand near the back wall, where the stone was dry and faintly warm against her palm, not heated like a stove, but temperate, the way soil feels 3 feet down in any season. The floor sloped gently toward the left wall, where meltwater had carved a shallow channel that ran forward toward the throat and out. The right side was flat and dry. A sleeping platform could be raised there on split poles, above the waterline, above the cold floor, in the steadiest part of the air. She sat in the chamber and held the candle at knee height and watched the flame lean and lean and breathe, patient as a heartbeat. And she thought, this is not a hole. This is a room that the earth already heated. The rock buffered the air. The air moved but did not rush. The temperature held near 55 degrees, while the surface froze and thawed and froze again. All she had to do was put a door on it. She came out and told Eli what she planned. Eli said, "Will it stay warm?" Randy said, "It will stay steady. Steady is better than warm." Eli considered this with the gravity that 9-year-old children bring to matters of survival when they have already buried a father. Then she said, "Can Peter breathe in there?" Randy said, "The air moves. It does not smoke. It does not freeze." Yes. Tamsin Pike arrived that afternoon, not out of friendship, but out of the practical concern that kept frontier women alive. Tamsin was 39, had 4 children under 12, a husband who freighted and was gone until March, and no tolerance for anything that could not be eaten, burned, or worn. She had heard from the teacher that Randy was spending time in the gorge instead of begging for wood, and she had come to investigate. Randy told her about the fissure. Tamsin listened the way she listened to everything, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her eyes measuring the distance between what she was hearing and what she believed was possible. She said, "A hole that feels warm for 10 minutes will not feed children for 10 days. Randy said the chamber held near 55 degrees when the surface was below zero. Tamsin said, 50 degrees keeps turnips. It does not keep children. Children need food, light, dry clothes, and a fire they can see. You are talking about putting Peter in a crack in the ground because you cannot afford wood, and you are calling it a plan." Randy said, "Peter cannot breathe in the cabin. The cabin is colder than the cave right now. The cabin will be colder tomorrow than it is today, and the day after that, and every day until I find fuel or we freeze. The cave does not get colder. The cave does not care what the weather does." Tamsin said, "Caves are damp. Caves are dark. Caves kill people. I knew a man in Iowa who went into a root cellar that had bad air, and they carried him out by his boots." Randy said, "I tested the air. The flame holds steady and leans outward. The air moves. It is not a sealed cellar. It breathes." Tamsin uncrossed her arms. She did not agree, but she stopped arguing, which was as close as Tamsin Pike ever came to admitting that another woman's logic had teeth. She left. At the door she turned back and said, "If you die in that hole, no one will find you until spring. Think about that when you bring the children." Randy thought about it. She thought about it while she started planning the door. Orrin Dace heard about the fissure before sundown. Small settlements work that way. A word from Tamsin to the teacher, from the teacher to the depot clerk, from the clerk to Orrin while buying lamp oil. By the time Randy entered the store the next morning to buy nails, every man at the counter knew that the widow Ossen was planning to live in a crack in the rocks like a burrowing animal. Orrin let the laughter run. 3 men stood near the stove warming their hands, and he let them finish shaking their heads and slapping their thighs before he spoke. He said, loud enough for Randy to hear from the nail bin, "She has decided to live in a crack like a badger." The men laughed again. One said she ought to remarry before the thaw, while there were still men willing to take on a widow with 2 sick children and a worthless cow. Another said the children belonged with families who could keep a fire going through January without crawling underground. The teacher, who had come in for chalk, asked quietly whether Eli and Peter should sleep in town just until matters were settled. He said it gently, the way people say gentle things that cut deeper than cruelty because they come wrapped in concern. Randy counted nails into a paper sack. 9 cents worth. 47 nails, each one a decision she could not undo. She asked whether anyone had a broken door or spare plank they had no use for. No one answered. The men looked at the stove. The teacher looked at his chalk. She paid for the nails and walked toward the door. Oren followed her outside. The cold was sharp and the light was flat and gray, and Pater was sitting on the store porch with his knees inside Eli's coat, small enough to disappear. Oren stood between Randy and the road, his breath making clouds that the wind shredded. He offered one final bargain. Sign over half the spring crop, and he would deliver green pine by morning, enough to see her through February if she burned carefully and did not ask questions about the quality. Randy said, "Green pine fills a cabin with smoke. Pater cannot breathe smoke." Oren said, "Green pine fills a cabin with heat. And heat, Mrs. Asen, is what keeps a county from taking your children." The words landed. Randy's hands tightened around the sack of nails until she could feel the points through the paper. Oren lowered his voice. Not out of kindness, out of the instinct that certain threats work better when they sound like advice. He said, "I am not threatening you. I am telling you what happens when a woman moves her children into a hole in the ground. The county hears about it. The county sends someone, and when that someone arrives, they do not ask whether you had a clever idea about cave air. They ask whether you are fit to raise children. That is a question you do not want asked." He stepped aside to let her pass. Randy walked. Eli walked behind her. Eli had heard every word, and her face carried the particular stillness of a 9-year-old who has just learned that adults can use concern the way other people use a fist. They did not speak until they reached the cabin. Then Eli said, "Is it true about the county?" Randy said, "They would have to come here first, and they have not come." Eli said, "Mr. Dace said they will." Randy knelt and looked at her daughter and said, "Mr. Dace sells wood. When people find heat without wood, Mr. Dace loses money. Remember that when you listen to what he says." Eli thought about this. Then she said, "Do we have enough nails?" They did not, but Randy had a hammer. 3 scavenged wagon boards pulled from under snow behind the freight depot where broken wagons went to rot. 2 pine slabs from a stump Tolliff had split before he died, and the kind of need that turns insufficient materials into engineering. She began the next morning. She carried the boards to the gorge on her back, one at a time, sinking to her knees in drifts along the ridge. The pine slabs were heavier. She dragged them on a piece of canvas, the same canvas that had covered Tolliff's coffin, because she did not own a second piece large enough, and the dead do not need canvas, and the living do. The Fissure mouth gaped at her, breathing its slow, steady breath into the January air, visible as a faint ribbon of vapor when the light was right. She set the boards against the rock and measured with her eyes and her hands, 30 inches wide, 5 feet high at the tallest point. She needed a cribbed frame, 2 vertical timbers wedged hard against the rock on both sides, and a door hung from that frame that sealed the wind but left a gap at the top she could open or close. A door that blocked but did not choke. A door that let the cave breathe through a slot she controlled. She started with the frame. The pine slabs, still sticky with frozen sap, needed trimming to fit the rock's irregular surface. She worked on her knees in the snow because there was no level ground near the Fissure mouth, shaping the wood with a hatchet Tolliff had sharpened in September and no one had touched since. The steel bit into the frozen pine and through chips that stuck to her flour sack gloves. The first slab split along a hidden knot on the second cut. The crack ran from the top down through the middle, turning one good timber into 2 narrow pieces neither strong enough to hold. She set the broken halves against the rock and stared at them, and the cold stared back. She started over with the second slab and the remnant of the first, fitting them together the way a woman fits a meal from scraps. Not because the scraps are sufficient, but because sufficiency is not available and insufficiency must be made to work. She wedged the paired pieces into the Fissure throat, driving them against the stone with the mallet she had made from a rock, lashed to a stick with rawhide cord. She packed smaller stones into the gaps between wood and limestone until the frame could not shift when she leaned against it. The frame held. She pushed it with both hands, then with her shoulder. The rock did not shift. The wood groaned but stayed. Her palms cracked on the second day. The cold opened the skin along the base of her thumbs, where the hatchet handle pressed hardest. She wrapped her hands in strips of flour sacking and kept working. Blood soaked through the sacking by midday and froze in dark spots that Eli stared at when Randy came home at dusk. Eli said nothing about the blood. She heated water on the cracked stove using fence rail sticks for fuel and set a basin on the floor for Randy to soak her hands. The water went pink. Eli poured it out and heated more. Pater's cough worsened that night. The cabin was perhaps 10 or 12 degrees above zero, warm enough to breathe, cold enough to make breathing hurt. She burned the last fence rail sticks and held both children against her body until dawn, feeling Pater's chest rattle against her ribs like a box with something loose inside. She counted his breaths, 14 per minute, too fast for a sleeping child. His body was working hard to stay warm, and the effort was costing him air he could not spare. She went back to the gorge at first light. The frame was holding. The rock had not shifted. The air still breathed outward through the throat, steady, patient, indifferent to everything happening on the surface above. She hung the wagon boards as a rough door using 2 strap hinges she had taken from a broken trunk lid in the cabin. The hinges were small and meant for a box lid, not a door, and the screws were short and the wood was thick, but they held the weight if she kept the door from swinging free. She drove the screws by hand, palm against the screwdriver handle, twisting until the flour sack wrapping turned red again. She left a gap of 4 inches at the top, the vent slot, and planned a sliding board to narrow or widen it. Behind the door, she hung a wool blanket doubled over and stitched to a strip of feed sack, a second barrier against drafts, the way her mother had hung blankets across the cellar mouth in Norway. Inside, the chamber held. She stood in the dark and felt the air move across her face, through the vent slot, outward. The candle at knee height leaned steady and gold. The floor was damp along the left channel but dry on the right, where she would build the sleeping platform. The stone at the back wall was dry under her hand. 52 degrees, maybe. Maybe 54. The number did not matter as much as the fact that it had not changed since she first felt it. The earth did not negotiate. It held what it held. She had a frame. She had a door. She had air that did not freeze and rock that did not change its mind. What she did not have was a drain trench for the meltwater that would come with any warm spell or any shift in pressure. She did not have a raised platform to keep the children off the stone floor where the cold pooled. She did not have a way to keep the bottom of the door from icing shut when the temperature plunged and moisture in the throat froze solid. She did not have a second candle for testing. She did not have certainty that the earth's breathing would continue through the worst of what January still had to give. And she did not yet know that Orrin Dace had already started telling men at the freight depot that the county ought to look into the Asen situation before something happened that made everyone responsible. He said it the way he said everything, not as a threat, not as gossip, but as the reasonable concern of a man who sold fuel to families who needed fuel and who could not understand why a widow would choose a hole in the ground over a half-cord of honest pine. Outside, the sky was the color of old iron, and the barometer in Orrin's store had fallen another 1/4 inch since morning. The horses at the depot stood with their tails to the north. The men who remembered the January 12th storm, the children's blizzard that had killed hundreds across Dakota Territory just weeks ago, stopped talking about the weather. When old-timers stop talking about the weather is about to talk for itself. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something everyone else dismissed before they understood it? The door was finished, but the room behind it was raw stone and standing water and darkness. The drain was uncut. The platform was unbuilt. The children were still sleeping in a cabin that could not keep frost off the inside of its own roof. And the weather was not going to wait for Randy Assen to decide whether she had built a shelter or dug her family's grave. The man appeared on the third morning when Randy was on her knees in the gorge, chipping ice from the base of the door frame with a cold chisel that kept slipping because her hands were wrapped in bloody flour sacking and the chisel handle was slick with frost. She heard the limp before she saw him, a dragging step on frozen stone, uneven, the rhythm of a man whose left leg had learned a different length than his right. She turned with the chisel raised because a woman alone in a gorge with her back to the entrance does not assume the best about approaching footsteps. He was 64, though the years sat heavier than the number. His coat was miner's canvas, patched at both elbows, and stained with something that was not dirt. He had a face like a closed fist, small eyes deep in weathered folds, a jaw that moved before it spoke, and hands that were enormous for his frame, scarred across every knuckle. He walked with a wooden-handled cane that he used less for balance and more as a probe, tapping the ground ahead of him the way a man taps the floor of a mine before he trusts it with his weight. His name was Aslak Vangen, Norwegian-born. Former copper miner from Ontonagon, Michigan, and after that, a Black Hills prospector who had found nothing worth keeping except the knowledge of how stone behaves when you put your life inside it. The limp came from a cave-in that had crushed his left ankle and killed the man beside him. He had been underground for 11 hours before they dug him out, and in those 11 hours he had learned things about air and darkness, and the sound of rock under pressure that no book could teach and no sane person would volunteer to learn. He had come to the gorge because he had heard the sound, not the gossip, the sound. A man in town had mentioned the widow's cave, and Aslak had listened not to the mockery but to the description. Air moving from inside the rock, a breathing fissure, warm draft in a frozen gorge. He knew that sound. He had spent 20 years listening for it in shafts and prospect holes and natural cavities across the upper Midwest. Moving air underground meant connected passages. Connected passages meant pressure differentials. Pressure differentials meant the cave system was larger than the opening, and the air inside it followed rules that had nothing to do with what January was doing on the surface. He stood at the fissure mouth and watched the vapor ribbon curling upward from the vent slot in Randy's new door. He tilted his head. He listened. Then he looked at Randy, still kneeling with her chisel raised, and said, "You are not guessing." "Good. Guessing kills people underground." Randy lowered the chisel. She did not answer. Aslak stepped closer to the door. He did not touch it. He studied the frame, the paired slabs, the stone packing, the gap where wood met rock. He ran his enormous hand along the left side without making contact, hovering an inch from the surface, feeling for air leaks the way a doctor feels for fever. He said, "Your frame is sound on the right. The left side will fail inside a month." Randy said, "Why?" Aslak said, "You wedged the timber with grain running vertical. That is correct for weight, but frost works differently than weight. Frost swells, and it swells hardest across grain. Your right side timber is wedged across grain by accident. The knot twisted the fiber, so frost will press it tighter against the rock. Your left side timber is wedged with grain. Frost will push it loose like a cork from a bottle." He was right. Randy could see it now. The grain on the left slab ran straight up, parallel to the fissure wall. When water froze in the gap between wood and stone, the ice would expand along the grain and push the timber inward, loosening the seal. Aslak said, "You need to pull the left timber and reset it rotated a quarter turn, across grain. It will bite harder every time it freezes instead of loosening." Randy said, "I cannot pull it. I packed stone behind it. If I pull the timber, the packing falls and I start over." Aslak nodded. He leaned his cane against the rock, lowered himself to one knee with a grunt that told the story of his ankle in a single sound, and looked at the base of the left timber where it met the gorge floor. He said, "You do not pull it. You shim it. Cut a wedge, hardwood, not pine, and drive it into the gap between the timber face and the rock, angled across grain. The wedge takes the frost pressure instead of the timber. When the wedge swells, it tightens. When it dries, you drive it again." He looked at her hands, still wrapped in their stained flower sacking. He looked at the chisel. He looked at the door. He said, "I have a hardwood mallet in my pack. I have ash stock for wedges, and I have nothing particular to do today that is more interesting than watching whether you know what you're doing." That was how Aslak van Gen entered the story, not with charity, not with pity, with curiosity and a mallet and the professional interest of a man who recognized method when he saw it and could not walk past it any more than a carpenter can walk past a joint being cut wrong. They worked together that day and the next. Aslak did not take over. He taught by doing his part and watching Randy do hers, correcting only when failure was certain and staying quiet when the mistake would teach better than his voice. He taught her candle reading first, because candle reading was the difference between a shelter and a coffin. He lit a tallow stub and held it at the throat of the fissure, at waist height, at knee height, at the floor. He showed her how the flame leaned differently at each level, stronger near the top where warm air pushed out, weaker near the floor where cooler air crept in. He said, "You read a cave the way you read a river. The current tells you everything, but only if you watch at every depth." He showed her the blue flame test. He cupped his hand behind the candle and brought it close to a low crack in the chamber wall. The flame dipped blue at its base and guttered. He pulled it back. The flame recovered. He said, "Bad air pools in low places. It is heavier than good air. It sits in pockets like water in a ditch. If the flame goes blue and low, you do not enter that space. You do not put a child in that space. You do not put a sleeping person in that space. If you wake up and the candle on the shelf has gone out, you leave. You ask why later, from outside." Randy memorized this. She made Eli memorize it too. On the fourth day, Aslak taught cribbing pressure, how to brace a timber against irregular stone so that the stone's own weight locked the brace in place. He used 2 sticks and a fist-sized rock to demonstrate the principle, pressing the sticks apart against the inside of the fissure throat until they could hold his weight. The trick was angle, too steep and the brace slid, too shallow and it buckled. The correct angle, he showed her with his hands, roughly 70 degrees from horizontal, made the brace want to stay. Gravity became an ally instead of an enemy. He said, "Underground, you do not fight the rock. You convince it to hold itself up. The rock wants to be stable. Your job is to show it how." On the 5th day, a thaw came. Not a true thaw. The temperature climbed above freezing for only 6 hours, but it was enough. Meltwater poured through the gorge and into the fissure throat and across the chamber floor. By afternoon, the right side of the chamber, the dry side, the sleeping side, had an inch of standing water. The children's bedding, which Randy had already carried into the chamber in anticipation, was soaked. Randy stood in the chamber with water around her boots and felt the math shift again. The cave that would save them from cold could drown their supplies in a single warm afternoon. Aslak said nothing for a long time. He stood at the throat and watched the water move. Then he said, "Drain discipline. Water is more dangerous than cold underground. A dry floor is survival. A wet floor is sickness and rot and hypothermia slower than freezing, but just as final." He showed her where to cut. The left wall already had a natural channel carved by centuries of meltwater, but the channel was shallow and partially blocked by loose stone near the throat. Randy needed to deepen it by 4 inches and clear the blockage so water flowed out of the chamber instead of pooling in it. She cut the drain trench with the cold chisel. The stone was limestone, softer than granite, but harder than anything her hands wanted to deal with after 5 days of labor. She knelt in the water and struck the chisel with Aslak's mallet, and each strike sent a shock through her wrist and forearm that she felt in her teeth. She worked for 4 hours. Aslak could not kneel. His ankle would not allow it, so he stood at the throat and talked her through the grade, telling her when the trench was deep enough and when it needed another half-inch to ensure flow. By dusk, the water was moving. Not fast, but moving, draining toward the throat and out through the gap under the door frame. The right side of the chamber was damp, but no longer standing. The bedding would need drying, but the principle held, if the drain stayed clear, the floor stayed dry. Her hands bled through the wrapping. She did not re-wrap them. There was no clean cloth left. On the 6th day, Orendace's men came to the gorge. There were 2 of them, freight hands who worked Oren's woodyard and owed him labor or credit or both. They did not speak to Randy. They walked past her to the pile of scrap planks she had stacked near the gorge mouth, boards she had scavenged from the depot wreckage over 3 days of searching, and loaded them onto a hand sled. Randy said, "Those are mine. I pulled them from the waste pile." The taller man said, "Mr. Dace says the waste pile is his property, depot land." Randy said, "The depot foreman told me I could take what was broken." The man shrugged. "Take it up with Mr. Dace." They pulled the sled away with 6 boards that Randy had planned to use for the sleeping platform. She watched them go and felt something tighten in her chest that was not grief and not fear, but the particular fury of a person who is being stolen from by someone who will call it business. Aslak watched from the fissure mouth. He said nothing, but that evening, when Randy returned to the cabin, she found a bundle of split willow poles leaning against the porch. No note, no name. The poles were green but straight, and there were enough of them to frame a platform if she lashed them with rope. She learned later that Aslak had cut them from a willow stand near the creek and carried them on his back, 1 load at a time, while she was arguing with Oren's men. He never mentioned it. She never asked. On the 7th day, something unexpected. Eli came home from the settlement with 2 old iron hinges wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She said Tamsin Pike had given them to her at the schoolhouse and told her to say nothing about where they came from. The hinges were heavy, forged, meant for a barn door or a heavy gate. They were better than the trunk lid hinges holding the cave door, which were already bending under the weight. Randy replaced the hinges that evening. The new ones held the door steady and true. She could open and close it with 1 hand. She could feel the difference immediately. The seal was tighter. The swing was controlled. The vent slot stayed consistent instead of shifting every time the wind gusted. Tamsin Pike, who had warned Randy she would die in the hole, had sent the tools to make the hole safer. She had done it through a child, without her name attached, because frontier women understood that help and disapproval could live in the same person without contradiction. On the same day, Ezra Bellows passed the gorge on his way to check a fence line. He did not stop. He did not speak. But the next morning, Randy found a broken freight sled runner leaning against the rock near the fissure mouth. It was oak, 3 feet long, heavy, split along one edge but solid through the core. It was exactly the right size to brace the cave door from inside, a bar that could be dropped into brackets and hold the door shut against wind pressure or the cave's own breathing surges. Ezra was not converted. He still believed the cave was foolishness, but he had seen the children, and he could not watch children freeze while maintaining a principle about firewood. The sled runner was not agreement. It was the smallest possible action a man could take without admitting he was wrong. Randy installed the brace that afternoon. The door was now framed, hinged, braced, vented, and curtained. The drain ran clear. The sleeping platform, about willow poles lashed with rope and topped with a mat of dried grass Eli had gathered from under snow, raised the sleeping surface 8 inches off the stone floor. A candle shelf cut into the wall at knee height held 2 tallow stubs and Randy's mother's lesson: read the flame, trust the lean, leave if it gutters blue. The chamber was ready, or as ready as a crack in the earth could be when it was being asked to replace a cabin, a stove, and 6 cords of wood that did not exist. So Randy performed her test the next morning with Aslak watching. She hung a tin cup of water from a nail in the cabin wall and a second tin cup from a peg she had driven into the chamber's back wall. She filled both cups at the same time from the same bucket. She waited. By dawn the next day, the cabin cup had a skin of ice across its surface thick enough to hold a finger's weight. The chamber cup was liquid, not warm, not steaming, but liquid, clear, undisturbed. The water had not even thickened. Aslak produced a mercury thermometer from his coat, a miner's instrument, glass tube in a brass case, marked in degrees and used for decades to check shaft temperatures before sending men down. He read the thermometer at 3 locations. Outside, at the gorge mouth, exposed, 12 degrees below 0. Inside the cabin, near the children's bed, at dawn before any fuel was burned, 4 degrees above 0. Inside the chamber, at the back wall, where the sleeping platform stood, 52 degrees. The difference between the cabin and the chamber was 48 degrees. The difference between the surface and the chamber was 64 degrees. The rock held heat the way a bank held money, not generating it, not adding to it, but refusing to let it leave. Aslak wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper and handed it to Randy. He said, "Keep this. You will need proof when they ask how you did it." Randy folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket next to the 9 cents she had left after buying nails. But doubt remained. Tamsin came to look at the chamber and stood in the throat with her arms crossed. She touched the wall. She looked at the water cup. She said, "Liquid water is not proof of a home. A root cellar holds liquid water. People do not live in root cellars." Ezra, who had heard about the thermometer readings from Aslak, came to the gorge mouth but would not enter. He stood outside and said, "A steady chamber can become deadly if the air reverses. Low pressure pulls air in. High pressure pushes it out. If a storm drops the pressure fast enough, the cave sucks surface air inward, and the draft dies. When the draft dies, you breathe your own air until it runs out." Aslak, standing beside Randy, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Ezra is correct." The words hit Randy harder than any of Oren's mockery. Aslak, who had taught her every principle the cave relied on, was agreeing with the man who said the cave could kill her. Aslak continued, "That is why the vent slot exists. The vent is not for comfort. It is for survival. When the pressure drops, you open the slot wide. You trade warmth for air. You let the cave lose heat rather than lose oxygen. The door must never be sealed completely. If you seal it, you are not in a shelter. You are in a jar." Randy looked at the vent slot, 4 inches of gap at the top of the door, controlled by a sliding board she could move with one hand. 4 inches between shelter and suffocation. 4 inches between life and a jar. The barometer in Oren's store continued to fall. Wind shifted to the north. Horses at the depot stood with their tails pressed flat against their hindquarters. The sky had a color that was not gray and not white, but something between, the color of a bruise that has not yet decided how bad it will be. Old-timers said little. The January 12th storm, the children's blizzard that had swept across Dakota Territory without warning and killed school children caught between their desks and their homes, was barely 2 weeks old in memory. The bodies had been found in snowdrifts, in fence lines, in open fields where children had wandered blind in whiteout conditions 100 yards from shelter. Nobody talked about that storm. Everybody thought about it. Randy moved everything she could carry into the chamber: bedding, flour, beans, the water crock, the lantern, stove tools she might need for the chisel or the vent, the family Bible, which was the only book she owned and the only object in the cabin that had come from Norway besides her memory. She carried each load on her back through the gorge and through the Fissure throat and set it in its place. Eli helped. Pater sat at the gorge mouth wrapped in a quilt and watched, his breathing thin and rapid in the cold air. The stove stayed in the cabin. The stove was iron and weighed more than Randy could move alone. And besides, there was no chimney in the chamber and no need for one. The cave's warmth did not come from fire. It came from stone, from depth, from the earth's refusal to follow the sky's moods. She chose the cave not as storage, but as home. The cabin was now the storage, a cold shell holding tools and a cracked stove, and the memory of a man who had nailed its roof in better times. The last thing she carried was the candle box. 4 tallow stubs, enough for 8 hours of light if she burned them one at a time, enough for 8 hours of air testing. After that, she would read The Cave by Feel Alone, the way Aslak had read minds for 20 years after his lanterns ran dry. Aslak met her at the fissure that evening. The wind had picked up. The vapor ribbon from the vent slot was blowing horizontal instead of curling upward. The cave was exhaling hard. He said, "The pressure's dropping fast. The cave knows before the barometer does. When the exhale gets this strong, a storm is 12 to 18 hours away." He looked at Randy. He looked at the door. He said, "When it comes, open the vent wide. Do not try to hold heat. Hold air. You can survive 50 degrees. You cannot survive no oxygen." Randy said, "Will you come inside?" Aslak said, "I have a room at the boarding house. I will be fine." Randy said, "I did not ask if you would be fine. I asked if you would come inside." Aslak smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his face from a closed fist to something that had once been young. He said, "A shelter is not a place, Mrs. Asen. It is a set of habits. You have the habits. You do not need me sitting in your chamber taking up air." He touched the door frame, the one he had taught her to shim, the one that would tighten with every freeze instead of loosening, and then he walked back through the gorge with his cane tapping the stone ahead of him, and the wind swallowed the sound of his limp. The storm came after dusk the next day. It did not build. It arrived. The temperature fell through 0 and kept falling the way a stone falls through water, steady, heavy, without pause. Snow came sideways, not falling but driven, horizontal sheets of white that erased the gorge and the hills and the road to Minnetonka Junction and everything else that depended on the sky to hold its shape. The wind was not wind. It was pressure. It pushed against the cabin walls and found every gap Ezra had cataloged and poured through them with a sound like fabric tearing. In town, chimneys smoked. Families burned wet pine so fast that sparks flew from flue pipes and rooms filled with haze. The Jensens, 2 miles north, burned their entire woodpile by midnight and started on fence rails. The bachelor Whitcomb tried to cross the open ground between his soddy and the depot, and lost the road inside 30 yards. He would be found at dawn, alive but with both hands frozen white to the wrists, his gloves having come off when he fell and could not find them in the drift. At Randy's cabin, the last memory of warmth died before the storm was an hour old. Frost did not feather the roof this time. It crawled across the walls, across the bed frame, across the stove itself. The cracked firebox, empty and cold since the last fence rail sticks burned 2 days ago, wore a skin of ice that gleamed in the dark. Pater's cough turned sharp, not the whistle anymore, but a bark, short and hard, the sound of lungs that were tightening against air that hurt to breathe. Randy made the decision. She wrapped Pater in the quilt and lifted him onto her hip. She told Eli to carry the lantern and stay close. They left the cabin door open behind them because it no longer mattered. The cabin was not shelter anymore. It was a box full of cold. The gorge was 100 yards from the cabin, but 100 yards in a plains blizzard is a distance that has killed grown men. The snow was not falling around them. It was moving through them, a horizontal river of ice crystals that scoured exposed skin and filled the eyes and stole breath from the mouth before the lungs could use it. Randy bent double over Pater and walked into the wind. Eli held the back of Randy's coat with one hand and the lantern with the other. Halfway through the gorge, Eli slipped. The gorge floor was ice under an inch of new snow, polished smooth by the afternoon's melt-freeze cycle. Eli's right foot went sideways, her left knee hit stone, and the lantern flew from her hand and struck the gorge wall. The glass chimney cracked from base to rim. The flame survived, barely, a weak yellow tongue licking sideways in the draft, protected only by the remaining half of the chimney that had not shattered. Randy stopped. She could not put Pater down. The snow was already covering the gorge floor, and Pater could not stand in wind this strong. She shifted his weight to her left hip and reached down for Eli with her right hand. Eli took it. Blood ran from the girl's knee into her stocking, black in the lantern's failing light. They had 50 yards to go. Pater could not walk them. His legs had stopped working properly, not frozen, not injured, but too small and too cold and too scared to hold his weight in wind that pushed harder than a 5-year-old could push back. Randy set the broken lantern on a rock ledge where the gorge wall sheltered it, grabbed a feed sack from the supplies she had cached near the fissure mouth, spread it on the snow, and put Pater on it. She dragged. Eli held the lantern with both hands and walked behind, limping, bleeding, silent. The fissure door was iced shut at the bottom. Moisture from the cave's exhale had condensed and frozen along the lower edge of the door frame where wood met stone. A ridge of ice, 2 inches thick and hard as iron, sealed the door to the rock. The latch moved. The hinges moved. The door did not. Randy set Pater against the gorge wall, took the hatchet from the cache, and swung at the ice. Chips flew. The hatchet bounced off stone and bit into ice and bounced again. Her hands, still wrapped in their stained flour sacking, could barely grip the handle. She swung 10 times, 20, each strike a guess in the dark because the lantern was behind her and the wind was in her face and the ice was the same color as the rock. Pater's lips were changing color. She could not see this in the dark, but she could hear it. His breathing had gone from barking to shallow, the sound of a body that was conserving everything for the core and abandoning the edges. Eli crouched beside him and pressed her body against his and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Randy swung the hatchet one more time and felt the ice crack along the full length of the door base. She dropped the hatchet and pulled. The door groaned and opened 6 inches. She pulled harder, a foot, 18 inches. Enough. She pushed Pater through the throat first, sliding him across the stone on the feed sack. Then Eli, on hands and knees, dragging the broken lantern. Then Randy, pulling the door shut behind her and dropping the oak brace into its brackets. The blanket curtain snapped inward as the door closed, the cave exhaling through every gap, the pressure inside higher than the pressure outside, the earth pushing back against the storm. Then the curtain settled, the air steadied. The sound of the wind dropped from a roar to a hum to something that lived outside the stone and could not enter. Pater lay on the feed sack on the sleeping platform, shaking. Eli climbed up beside him. Randy lit the candle stub on the knee-height shelf and watched the flame. It leaned outward, steady gold, no blue, no guttering. The air was moving. The air was good. But the cave was breathing hard. She could feel the pressure pulses, the exhale pushing air through the vent slot and around the door edges in rhythmic surges, the inhale pulling faintly back. The blanket curtain moved with each cycle, swaying like a slow heartbeat. Outside, the barometric pressure was plummeting, and the cave was responding the way Aslak had described, pushing its warmer, higher pressure air outward through every opening. Randy remembered the rule. She stood on the platform edge and reached up to the vent slot and slid the board to its widest position. 4 inches became 6. Cold air entered from the top of the door and mixed with the chamber air. The temperature dropped from 52 degrees to something cooler, 48, maybe 45. But the flame on the candle shelf strengthened. More air, more oxygen, colder but breathable. The children's shaking slowed, not stopped, slowed. The chamber was not warm the way a cabin with a stove was warm. It was warm the way survival is warm, enough to keep blood moving, enough to keep lungs working, enough to keep a 5-year-old alive through a night that was killing everything on the surface that did not have 4 walls and a fire. Randy sat on the platform between her children and watched the candle and listened to the earth breathe and waited. Stay with this story, because the next choice decides whether the cave remains a refuge or becomes a place no one can escape. 2 hours into the storm, something hit the door. Not wind, wind pushes. This struck. A flat impact, then another, then a voice that was not the storm's voice, muffled by wood and wool and stone, but unmistakably human. Randy stood. She looked at the candle, still gold, still leaning outward. She lifted the oak brace from its brackets and opened the door 6 inches. Tamsin Pike stood in the Fissure throat with her youngest daughter wrapped inside her coat. The girl was 3, flushed red with fever, and coughing a thick, wet cough that was nothing like Peter's dry whistle. This was a smoke cough, a chimney cough, the sound of lungs that had breathed soot and creosote until they swelled. Tamsin's own face was streaked with black. Her eyes were wild. She said, "My chimney clogged. The room filled with smoke. I could not clear it. I could not stay." Randy pulled her inside. Now there were 5 people in a chamber 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, on a sleeping platform built for 3. 5 people breathing the air that the earth breathed out. 5 mouths consuming oxygen. 5 bodies generating moisture. The candle flame, which had been steady, began to waver, not from bad air, not yet, but from the increased demand of 5 sets of lungs pulling from the same supply. Randy did the math. More bodies meant more heat from skin alone. More bodies also meant more carbon dioxide, more moisture condensing on the walls, more panic in a small dark space. The chamber that had held 3 comfortably now held 5 tightly, and the margin between refuge and suffocation had narrowed. She moved everyone to the raised platform, the only dry surface. She cracked the vent slot to its maximum. She set the candle low, at ankle height, where bad air would show first. She told Eli to watch the flame and say nothing else. Eli watched. Tamsin's daughter coughed and cried. Peter pressed against Randy's side and did not cough, which was the first time in weeks that Petter had stopped coughing, and Randy realized with a shock that the cave air, warm, humid, free of smoke and dust and the dry razor cold of the cabin, was better for his lungs than anything she had been able to provide above ground. Tamsin sat rigid against the back wall and said nothing. She had mocked this cave. She had warned Randy that caves kill people. She had told Randy to think about dying unfound. Now she was inside the cave with her sick daughter, breathing the air she had dismissed, sitting on the platform she had doubted, alive because the woman she had criticized had built what she said could not be built. She did not apologize. Tamsin Pike did not apologize, but she held her daughter close and looked at the candle and looked at Randy, and in her eyes was something that had not been there before. And it was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of a practical woman who had just learned that someone else's impractical idea was the only reason her child was not breathing smoke in a frozen cabin. The night passed in hours that felt like days. The storm screamed above the gorge. The cave breathed its measured breath. The candle flame held steady at ankle height, gold and upright, the air cycling through the vent slot in pulses that matched the pressure changes outside. When the wind gusted hardest, the exhale surged and the curtain snapped. When the wind paused, the breathing slowed. The cave was not fighting the storm. It was riding it, the way a ship rides a swell, moving with the pressure, adjusting, never breaking. Randy did not sleep. She watched the flame. She listened to 5 people breathe. She counted the children's respirations. Peter at 12 per minute now, slower than he had been in the cabin, his lungs easing in the humid air. Tamsin's daughter at 16, still fast, still sick, but no longer coughing the wet-racking cough that meant smoke in the bronchi. Outside, the world was ending. The temperature reached 30 below on exposed ground and kept falling. Orrin Dace's fuel shed caught fire when his men tried to thaw frozen billets too close to a stove. The green wood he had sold at $4 a half cord smoldered more than it burned, filling houses with the same creosote smoke that had driven Tamsin out. Ezra Bellows's team of horses broke loose from the depot shelter and ran blind into the storm. He found them at dawn huddled behind a rock wall, alive, their manes frozen into solid sheets. Inside the chamber, no fire burned, no chimney clogged, no smoke filled the air, no fuel ran out because no fuel was needed. The temperature held above 50 degrees near the rear wall. Breath condensed on the ceiling but did not freeze. The water crock sat on the platform untouched by ice. The drain trench carried moisture from the walls to the throat and out. After 2 nights, Randy opened the door to a world glazed white and silent. The storm had passed. The gorge walls sparkled with ice. The sky was the pale blue that follows violence, clean, empty, exhausted. She stepped outside and breathed surface air and felt it cut her lungs like a blade after 2 days of the cave's steady warmth. Ezra Bellows appeared at the gorge mouth an hour later, following a faint ribbon of vapor that rose from the fissure vent into the still morning air. He had been searching since dawn, checking on homesteads along the creek, counting the living and noting the dead. He had expected to find Randy's cabin empty and Randy's family frozen. Instead, he found the cabin rimed with ice, the stove cold, the door open, and no bodies. He followed the tracks, mostly filled with drift but still faintly visible, to the gorge, and then he followed the vapor. He stood at the fissure mouth and looked inside. He saw 5 people on a raised platform. He saw a candle burning at ankle height. He saw a door with a vent slot and an oak brace and forged hinges. He saw dry bedding, a water crock, a flour sack, a Bible. He saw that Randy Asen had burned no fuel for 2 nights in the worst storm since the children's blizzard. and everyone inside the chamber was alive. He said nothing. He removed his hat and stood in the fissure throat and breathed the warm air and said nothing for a long time. Pater's cough had eased. Tamsin's daughter was sleeping. Eli sat on the platform with her knees drawn up, watching Ezra with the same steady eyes she had watched everything with since October, the eyes of a girl who had learned that the world takes fathers and sends storms and offers no explanations, but who had also learned that her mother could carve shelter from stone with a hatchet and a cold chisel and 9 cents worth of nails. The cave had held. The earth had breathed. The door had groaned under pressure changes, and the curtain had snapped and the vent slot had whistled in the strongest gusts. But everything Randy had built, every brace, every shim, every drain cut, every lesson Aslak had taught and she had remembered, had done what it was supposed to do. But survival proved in silence means nothing until someone says it out loud. And the question that now pressed against the fissure walls was not whether the cave worked. It was whether anyone would admit it. Ezra Bellows entered the fissure the next afternoon, alone, when the light was strong enough to see by and the wind had dropped to something a man could walk through without leaning. He had to crouch through the throat. He was taller than Randy and wider through the shoulders, and the fissure walls pressed against his coat on both sides. He came through into the chamber and stood upright, and removed his gloves and stood still for a long time, looking at everything. He touched the back wall. He held his palm flat against the stone the way he might touch a horse's flank to check for fever, and what he felt was not fever, but the opposite, steadiness, the temperature of something that had been the same for longer than anyone in the room had been alive. He looked at the drain trench cut along the left wall. He crouched slowly, his knees protesting, and ran his finger along the channel's edge. Clean cut. Proper grade. Water would run toward the throat, not pool. He looked at the door from the inside, the oak brace and its brackets, the vent slot with its sliding board, the blanket curtain, damp from 2 days of condensation but still hanging square, the forged hinges Tamsin had sent through Eli. He looked at the sleeping platform. Willow poles lashed with rope, topped with grass matting, raised 8 inches off the stone floor. Dry, level, high enough that water from the drain side could not reach the bedding. He looked at the candle shelf cut into the wall at knee height. 2 tallow stubs, one burned to a nub, one fresh. The shelf was positioned so the flame was visible from the platform. A sleeper could open one eye and check the air without standing. He understood. He was a man who had freighted supplies through blizzards for 20 years, and he understood logistics the way a musician understands melody, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions made correctly under pressure. What he was looking at was not a hole in the ground with blankets in it. It was an engineered shelter built by a woman with 9 cents worth of nails and a cold chisel and a dead husband and 2 children who needed air more than they needed fire. He put his gloves back on. He looked at Randy, who was standing near the door with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and her eyes asking nothing because she had stopped asking men for approval 3 months ago when she buried Tollef on the claim. He said, "I was wrong about the stone. Fire keeps a man alive if he can feed it. This kept you alive when there was nothing left to feed." Randy said, "The stone did not do it alone." Ezra said, "No, you did it. The stone just held still while you worked." He left the chamber and walked back through the gorge. At the mouth, he turned and said, "I will tell people what I saw, whether they believe it is their business." He told people. He told them at the depot and at the feed barn and at the store, and he told them in the particular way that Ezra Bellows told things, without ornament, without excitement, with the flat factual tone of a man delivering freight reports. He said the chamber held 52 degrees when the surface was 30 below. He He said no fuel was burned. He said 5 people survived 2 nights, including a 3-year-old with smoke sickness in her lungs. He said the drain worked, the door held, the air stayed clean. People listened. Some believed, some did not. But Ezra Bellows was not a man who exaggerated, and the people who knew him knew that, and the people who knew that told the people who did not. Tamsin Pike came back to the Fissure 3 days after the storm. She came alone without her children in the middle of the morning when the light was best. She did not announce herself. She stood at the throat and called Randy's name and waited until Randy came to the door. She said, "Show me." Randy showed her the drain, the vent, the candle shelf, the platform. The way the flame leaned outward at every height. The way the air moved without rushing. The way the temperature held regardless of what the sky was doing. Tamsin touched the walls. She put her hand on the back stone and held it there. She looked at the ceiling and the floor and the door and the blanket and the brace. She said, "My root cellar has a draft. I never thought about whether the draft was good or bad. I just thought it was cold." Randy said, "Test it. Hold a candle at the entrance. If the flame leans outward, the air is moving and the cellar is breathing. If it stands still, the air's dead, and you should not stay long. If it leans inward, the cellar is pulling air from outside, and you're fighting the weather instead of hiding from it." Tamsin said, "And if it goes blue?" Randy said, "Leave." Tamsin nodded. She started toward the throat, then stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "The hinges. They were from my husband's tool chest. He would have given them himself if he had been home." She left. That afternoon, Eli reported that Tamsin had been seen at her root cellar with a candle, crouching at the entrance the way Randy had described, watching the flame. Neighbors came. Not all at once and not in crowds, but in the way that frontier people come to see something they have heard about and do not yet believe, one at a time, with excuses. A man checking fence lines who happened to pass the gorge. A woman returning borrowed flour who wanted to see the door. The teacher who brought chalk for Eli and stayed an hour asking questions about limestone and airflow that Randy answered patiently while the man wrote notes on the back of a hymn sheet. They asked whether every cellar could do the same. Randy refused to exaggerate. She said most holes are just holes. A cellar with dead air is not a shelter. A shallow pit is not a chamber. You need moving air, which means connected passages or pressure differentials. You need dry floor, which means drainage and grade. You need soundstone, which means tapping for hollow plates and checking for frost spalling. And you need a way out. Never seal yourself completely. Never block the vent. Never trust a door you cannot open from both sides. Some people nodded. Some looked skeptical. All of them went home thinking differently about the ground under their feet. The numbers traveled faster than the stories. Families compared costs, and the comparison was brutal. Oren's wet green pine, $4 per half cord, burned fast, smoked hard, clogged chimneys, and left creosote that could catch fire. Randy's cave door, salvaged planks from a waste pile, 9 cents worth of nails, 2 hinges from Tamsin's husband's tool chest, 1 sled runner from Ezra's broken freight sled. Total cash outlay, 9 cents. Fuel burned inside the refuge during the crisis. None. Number sheltered at peak. 5 people through 2 nights. Number of chimneys clogged. 0, because there was no chimney and no fire, and no smoke and no need for any of them. Oren Dace heard the numbers. He heard them from customers who repeated them at his counter while buying less wood than they had planned. He heard them from men who smiled when they said them, not because the men disliked Oren, but because the math was funny in the way that truth is sometimes funny when it arrives at the expense of someone who profits from the old way of doing things. Oren said the story was exaggerated, He said 52 degrees was impossible underground in January. He said 5 people could not survive 2 nights without fire. He said the widow was lucky, and luck is not a method. Then Ezra Bellows, standing at the counter buying rope, said, I held my hand on the back wall. I read the thermometer myself. If you want to call me a liar, Orrin, say it plain, and I will take my rope business to Rapid City. Orrin did not call Ezra a liar. He sold him the rope at full price and said nothing else about the cave for 3 days, which was the longest Orrin Dace had gone without an opinion on any subject since he arrived in Dakota Territory. But silence was not surrender. Orrin was calculating. The cave had cost him credibility and wood sales, and the quiet assumption that winter in Minnetonka Junction required his fuel yard, the way breathing required air. If Randy's method spread, if families began testing cellars and ravines and fissures the way Randy tested hers, his $4 half cords of green pine would stack unsold until they rotted. He needed a different angle. He would find it. The weeks after the storm were the deepest part of winter, but inside the fissure the season was an abstraction. Randy and the children lived in the chamber through the rest of January and into February, sleeping on the platform, eating beans and flour, melting snow for water in a pot set on the stone floor where the air was coolest, reading the candle twice a day the way a sailor reads the sky. Aslak came every morning. His limp was worse in cold weather. The crushed ankle stiffened overnight and needed an hour of walking before it bent properly. But he came, carrying his mallet and his cane, and sometimes a piece of ash stock or a handful of iron nails he had bought with money Randy did not ask about. They improved the chamber together. Aslak mixed lime from a deposit he knew near the creek and showed Randy how to whitewash the rear wall with a brush made from twisted grass. The lime dried pale against the dark limestone and caught the lantern light and threw it back. The chamber went from a cave to a room in a single afternoon, not because the lime changed the temperature or the air, but because it changed the feeling. A white wall is a wall someone chose. A dark wall is a wall the earth made. The difference between those two things is the difference between shelter and imprisonment. He said, "Beauty is not vanity underground. Order prevents panic. When a child wakes in the dark and sees a white wall instead of raw stone, the child does not scream. That is not decoration. That is survival." They set shelves into cracks in the stone, flat rocks wedged between natural ledges, shimmed with wood chips until they held level. A shelf for the water crock, a shelf for the candle box, a shelf for cups and spoons, and the small knife Randy used for everything from cutting bread to trimming candle wicks. Each shelf was an act of domestication, a claim staked not on land but on the space inside the land. Aslak built a second inner door from lighter boards, pine thinner than the outer door, hung on pegs rather than hinges. It created an airlock between the throat and the chamber, a buffer that slowed the pressure surges during storms and kept the worst of the cold air intrusions from reaching the sleeping platform. The two-door system was a mine technique. Aslak had seen it in copper shafts where ventilation doors controlled airflow through miles of underground passages. Scaled down to a 12-foot chamber, it worked the same way. One afternoon in late February, while they were cutting a second candle shelf into the opposite wall, Randy asked Aslak about the cave-in. He did not answer immediately. He set down the chisel and sat on the platform edge and looked at his hands, the scarred, enormous hands that had pulled rock off his own body in the dark for 11 hours, while the man beside him stopped breathing. He said the man's name was Torvald. He said Torvald had a wife in Hancock, Michigan, and 2 daughters. He said the shaft had been timbered wrong, the supports set too far apart, the crossbeams too thin, the angle off by degrees that looked like nothing but meant everything when the weight shifted. He said he had heard the timber creak 10 seconds before the collapse, and had shouted, but the shout came too late because sound travels slower than rock falls. He said, I was underground for 11 hours. The first hour I tried to dig out. The second hour I tried to breathe slowly. The third hour I talked to Torvald, even though Torvald was not breathing. By the fifth hour, I had stopped being afraid and started listening. The rock speaks if you're quiet enough. It told me where the weight was sitting and where the air was moving and which way the rescuers would come from. I survived because I listened. He paused. He said, Torvald survived because I was there to tell them where to dig. They found him under the second crossbeam. He was alive for 3 more days, and then he was not. Randy said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. Aslak picked up the chisel and went back to work. He cut the shelf with the same precision he cut everything, measured, deliberate, the chisel striking the stone at exactly the angle that would chip rather than crack. He did not mention Torvald again, but that evening, before he left the gorge, he stopped at the inner door and cut 3 lines into the wood with his knife. 3 vertical marks, evenly spaced, about 2 inches tall. He pointed to each one. He said, air, water, way out. Everything else is optional. He did not explain further. He touched the door frame and walked into the gorge with his cane tapping ahead of him. In March, Aslak's cough started. It was different from Pater's. Pater's cough was a child's cough, thin, high, the protest of small lungs against cold air. Aslak's cough was deep and wet and came from a place in his chest that had been damaged by 20 years of rock dust and stale air and the particular poison that copper mines breathe into the men who work them. Miner's lung. Randy had never heard the term, but she recognized the sound. It was the sound of a body consuming itself from the inside. He kept coming to the gorge. He kept working. But the work slowed. He rested more. He sat on the rock ledge outside the fissure and watched Randy cut a new drainage line and said, "Good grade," or half-inch more, and then he coughed until his eyes watered. One morning in early April, he did not come. Randy waited until noon, then walked to town. She found him in Ezra's spare room, lying on a cot, his face the color of ash. Ezra stood at the foot of the cot and said nothing, because Ezra knew what Miner's lung looked like, and there was nothing to say about it that the lungs were not already saying. Aslak saw Randy in the doorway. He said, "I am not dying in a cave. I spent enough time underground." She sat beside him. He told her where his tools were, the mallet, the candle lantern, the brass-cased thermometer, and a notebook filled with sketches of mine timbering that he had drawn over 20 years. He said the notebook was hers. He said the sketches would tell her things he had not had time to teach. He said, "You have good hands and better judgment. Do not let anyone who has not been underground tell you how stone works." He died on a Tuesday in April. The sky was clear, and the air smelled like mud, which is the smell of spring in Dakota Territory, the smell of ice finally losing its argument with the sun. Ezra buried him on the hill behind the boarding house with a wooden marker that said his name and the years, and nothing else, because Aslak had not been a man who required explanation. Randy stood at the grave with Aslak's hammer in her hand. She did not speak. Eli stood beside her. Pater stood beside Eli. The 3 of them looked at the fresh dirt and the wooden marker and the clear sky that Aslak had preferred to any mine shaft or cave or chamber. Because a man who has spent 11 hours buried under rock develops a preference for open air that lasts the rest of his life, however long that life turns out to be. She carried the hammer and the lantern and the notebook back to the chamber and set them on the shelf beside the candle box. The notebook's pages were soft with age and handling. The sketches were precise, cross-sections of timbered shafts, ventilation diagrams, bracing angles, pressure notes written in a mix of Norwegian and English, that Randy could read because her own thoughts moved between those languages the same way. 3 lines on the inner door: air, water, way out. Everything else was optional. She closed the notebook and went back to work. In May, the secondary crisis came from the direction Randy had least expected. The winter had been brutal, and the snowpack in the Black Hills was the deepest anyone could remember. When warm rains arrived in the 3rd week of May, 3 days of steady downpour on slopes still carrying 4 feet of compacted snow, the water had nowhere to go except down. Down the ravines, down the gorges, down every channel and crack and fissure that connected the surface to the spaces below. The gorge flooded in 6 hours. Water that had been snowpack at dawn was a brown torrent by afternoon, pouring over the limestone ledges and filling the narrow floor and rushing toward the fissure mouth with a sound like a locomotive running on gravel. Randy heard it from inside the chamber. The drain trench, which had handled meltwater all winter without complaint, began to overflow. Water rose from the channel and spread across the floor, covering the flat stone in a sheet that crept toward the platform. She got the children out first. Eli carried the candle box. Pater carried the Bible. Randy carried nothing because her hands needed to be free for the climb out of the throat, which was now running with water like a drain pipe. She stood outside the fissure in the rain and watched the water pour into the cave that had saved her family's life. The cave that had held steady through the worst blizzard in memory was now filling like a basin. The drain could not keep up. The lower door, the inner door Aslak had built, was already submerged at its base. If the water reached the sleeping platform, the bedding would soak. If it reached the shelves, the flour and beans would be ruined. If it rose high enough to block the throat, the chamber would become a cistern, and everything inside it would be lost. Randy could hear Aslak's voice in her head. Water is more dangerous than cold underground. A dry floor is survival. But Aslak was dead. Aslak was buried on a hill behind the boarding house, and his voice was a memory, and memories do not cut drainage trenches. She had to decide. Abandon the cave and let the flood take everything, or go back in and adapt. She went back in. The water was ankle deep across the floor and rising. She waded to the drain trench and saw the problem. The trench was working, but it was working at winter volume. The spring flood was 20 times what the winter melt had ever been. The single trench could not carry it. She needed a second trench. And she needed the lower door open, not closed, open wide, so the water pressure from inside the chamber could push water out through the throat instead of trapping it behind the door like a dam. She wedged the inner door open with a stone. Water surged through the gap and down the throat, but not fast enough. The level kept rising. She took the cold chisel, the same chisel she had used all winter, the one that had cut the first drain in frozen stone, and began cutting a second channel along the right side of the chamber, parallel to the first, but angled more steeply toward the entry. She worked in water up to her shins. The chisel slipped twice and gashed her left hand between the thumb and forefinger. She wrapped it with a strip torn from her sleeve and kept cutting. The stone was easier now than it had been in January, warmer, wetter, more willing to chip. But the urgency was worse because the water was still rising and the sound of the torrent in the gorge outside was getting louder. Eli appeared at the throat. Randy shouted at her to stay out. Eli stayed. She held the lantern from the throat opening so Randy could see her cuts, and she did not leave even when the water reached her knees. The second trench caught the flow. Not immediately. For 10 minutes, the water continued to rise, and Randy thought she had miscalculated, thought the chamber would fill, thought everything Aslak had taught her and everything she had built would end in a brown pool of snowmelt. Then the grade caught. The second trench connected to the throat at a steeper angle than the first, and the water found the faster path and took it. The level dropped, a quarter inch, then half an inch, then an inch. In 20 minutes, the platform was clear. In an hour, the floor was wet but not flooded, and the two trenches were carrying the spring runoff in parallel channels that merged at the throat and poured out through the gap under the wedged open door. She stood in the emptying chamber with water dripping from her sleeves and blood seeping through the wrapping on her hand, and she realized something that shifted the weight of the entire winter. She had not repeated Aslak's solution. The winter drain was Aslak's design: single trench, left wall, gentle grade. The flood drain was hers: second trench, right wall, steep grade, door wedged open. She had used his principle: water must move, not pool, but she had applied it in a way he had never shown her, to a problem he had not anticipated, in conditions he had never described. She was not Aslak's student anymore. She was her own. Share this with someone who understands that preparation is not fear. It is love measured before the emergency arrives. The flood receded in 2 days. The gorge drained. The chamber dried. Randy reset the inner door, cleaned both trenches, and carried the bedding outside to dry in the May sun. The flour was damp but usable. The beans were fine. Aslak's notebook, which she had left on the highest shelf, had not been touched by the water. Neighbors who had watched the gorge flood came to see the aftermath. They expected ruin. They found Randi on her knees outside the fissure, wringing water from a quilt, with Eli spreading beans on a flat rock to sun-dry, and Pater sitting on a log eating bread. Tamsin Pike stood at the gorge mouth and looked at the water still trickling from the fissure throat and said, "You stayed inside during the flood?" Randy said, "I went back in. The water would have taken everything." Tamsin said, "You could have drowned." Randy said, "I could have lost the shelter." Tamsin studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "Teach me the drain. My root cellar floods every spring, and I lose half my potatoes." That was the moment the cave stopped being Randy's secret and became the settlement's knowledge. Not because Ezra had told people what he saw, and not because the storm numbers had traveled, but because Tamsin Pike, the most practical woman in Minnetonka Junction, the woman who had mocked the cave and warned Randy she would die in it, had asked to be taught. Randy taught her. She taught Tamsin the candle test first, then the drain grade, then the difference between a vent that breathes and a hole that leaks. She made Tamsin perform each test herself. She did not lecture. She showed the way Aslak had showed her, the way her mother had showed her in Norway, by doing, by watching, by correcting only when the mistake would cause harm. She told Ezra which ravines near the settlement had breathing cracks and which only trapped cold. She walked the creek banks with the teacher and pointed out limestone formations that might indicate chambers below. She drew diagrams in the dirt showing how pressure differentials worked, not the physics, which she did not know by name, but the behavior, which she knew by feel and by Aslak's candle, and by the steady lean of a flame in a dark room. She did not charge. She did not claim special knowledge. She said the same thing every time someone asked how she knew. "My mother showed me how stone holds steady, and a miner named Aslak taught me how to listen." Orrin Dace watched all of this from behind his counter with the expression of a man watching his own inventory depreciate. He could not mock the cave anymore. He could not call it luck after the flood, because luck does not cut drainage trenches with a cold chisel in rising water. He could not dismiss the thermometer readings because Ezra Bellows had confirmed them, and Ezra Bellows did not lie, so he changed his angle. He began telling men at the freight depot that the gorge entrance sat on unsurveyed ground. Common ground, not part of Randy's 160 acres. If the fissure was not on her claim, then the improvements she had made were not her improvements, and anyone could walk in and use the chamber or file a claim of their own. The boundary question was not unreasonable. Survey lines in Dakota Territory were rough, and gorge edges and limestone outcrops did not follow the neat grid that the General Land Office had drawn on paper. Whether the fissure fell inside or outside Randy's claim was a question that could be answered, but answering it required a surveyor, and a surveyor cost money Randy did not have, and Orrin knew that. He filed a boundary complaint with the Land Office in late May. The complaint did not name Randy. It named the gorge as unimproved common ground subject to survey revision and requested a formal determination. Randy heard about the filing from the depot clerk, who told Tamsin, who told Randy while they were testing Tamsin's root cellar for air quality on a warm afternoon in early June. Tamsin said, "He cannot take what you built." Randy said, "He can make me prove I own it. Proving costs money or time. I have neither." Tamsin said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Ezra was there. I was there. The teacher was there. Half the settlement has stood inside that chamber. If Orrin wants to claim the gorge as common ground, he will have to explain to the county why a dozen people watched a woman build a shelter on common ground and said nothing." It was not a legal argument. It was a practical one. And practical arguments, in a place where the law was a man on a horse who visited twice a year, carried more weight than paper. But the complaint was filed, and the question was open, and Orrin Dace was patient the way Winter was patient, willing to wait, willing to let time do the work that force could not. Randy had survived the blizzard and the flood and the mockery and the threat. But the question of whether she could keep what she had built was not yet answered, and the man who wanted to take it was not finished trying. By midsummer of 1888, the fissure had become something Randy had not intended and could not have predicted. It had become a place people came to. Not to shelter, the summer air was warm enough for cabins and sod houses and even open sleeping under the stars when the mosquitoes allowed it. They came to learn. They came because the winter had shown them what they did not know, and the woman who lived 3 miles west of Minnetonka Junction knew things about stone and air and survival that no one else within 50 miles could teach. Randy taught the way Aslak had taught her, by making people do the work themselves. Tamsin Pike came twice a week through June. Randy walked her through her own root cellar and made her identify every draft source, every damp spot, every place where the candle flame told a story Tamsin had never thought to read. Tamsin's cellar breathed, not as steadily as the fissure, but enough. The draft came from a crack in the foundation where the house met the earth, and the air moved sluggishly outward most days, which meant the cellar was connected to something below, however small. Randy showed her how to deepen the cellar's natural drain, how to bank the walls with straw-packed earth to slow moisture, and how to build a simple vent cover from a sliding board and 2 nails. Tamsin said, "This is not a cave. This is a root cellar with better habits." Randy said, "That is all any of it is. Habits." Ezra brought his grandsons, 2 boys, 11 and 13, who had survived the children's blizzard by luck, and a school teacher who had roped them together and walked them to the nearest farmhouse in whiteout conditions. The boys had not been underground before. Randy let them enter the chamber with a candle each and told them to watch the flame and tell her what it said. The older boy understood immediately. The younger one held his candle too high and missed the draft. Randy adjusted his hand without explaining why, and after a moment the boy felt the lean and his eyes widened. She said, "The air talks. You have to hold the candle where the air's loudest." The boys came back 3 more times that summer. They mapped the gorge with knotted string, measuring distances the way Eli had learned, by counting knots and marking directions on a scrap of paper. They found 2 more breathing cracks in the limestone, both too narrow to enter, but both producing the faint vapor ribbon that meant moving air below. Randy told them not to enter any crack they had not tested, not to go alone, and not to trust a passage that went deeper than the length of rope they carried. She said, "The earth does not care about you. It is not trying to help. It is holding steady. Your job is to understand what steady means and not ask it to be more than that." The operation at the Fissure had grown beyond emergency shelter into something that resembled a small homestead annex. The main chamber, the original 12 by 8 space, served as the winter refuge and storm shelter, its walls whitewashed, its platform rebuilt with better timber, its 2 doors hung true. A second chamber, accessed through a low passage Randy had widened with the cold chisel during the spring, became food storage. The temperature inside held near 50 degrees year-round, which meant potatoes did not freeze in January and milk did not sour in July. Root vegetables lasted twice as long as they did in Tamsin's cellar. Seed grain stayed dry. Flat stones laid in a line from the outer door to the platform made a dry path that kept mud off the bedding. A drip line carved into the ceiling above the left wall channel caught condensation before it fell, directing it into the drain rather than onto the floor. A hinged shutter, Randy's own improvement, built from a pine board and 2 leather straps, replaced the sliding vent board, giving her finer control over airflow with one hand. The polished outer door, planed smooth and fitted tight, shed snow and rain, and signaled to anyone approaching the gorge that what lay behind it was not a crack in the rocks, but a place someone had built and maintained and intended to keep. A child-height shelf near the entrance held mittens, cups, candles, and the small knife arranged in the order Randy had established during the blizzard. The things you need in the first 30 seconds of arrival, placed where a child could find them in the dark. This was not decoration. It was the memory of Pater's panic when the lantern broke, encoded in shelf placement. Marked areas on the chamber floor, scratched lines in the stone, visible in lantern light, showed safe standing zones. The right side was dry. The left side drained. The back wall was warmest. The throat was coldest and wettest. A person entering for the first time could read the floor the way a person reads a map, because Randy had learned from the flood that panic does not read instructions, but panic does follow lines. 2 exits now served the chamber. The main Fissure entrance, with its double doors and vent system, handled all normal use. A crawl vent at the back of the second chamber, a natural crack Randy had cleared of loose stone and fitted with a removable cover, provided emergency egress. She had insisted on the second exit after Aslak's death, after the flood, after every lesson had been driven home that a single way in is a single way to die. A community rule emerged, not written but spoken and repeated until it carried the weight of law. No one enters alone. No one seals a door without a candle test. No child goes past the first scratch mark on the floor without an adult. These were Aslak's habits, Randy's enforcement, the settlement's inheritance. The hostile skeptic's final chapter opened in November of 1888, during the first hard pressure drop of the new winter. Orrin Dace had spent the summer and fall watching his fuel business shrink, not collapse. People still needed wood for cooking, for heating cabins they actually lived in, for the 100 daily uses that a cave could not replace. But the fear was gone. The desperate $4.50 cord purchases made by families who had no choice and no time, the purchases that had built Orrin's margin and funded his claim speculation, those had dropped by half. Families who had tested their cellars, banked their walls, dried their wood properly in summer instead of buying green pine in January, and learned to read a candle flame were not the same customers Orrin had relied on. They were still customers, but they were customers with options, and options make poor leverage. His boundary complaint had gone nowhere. Ezra Bellows and Tamsin Pike had signed statements at the land office, attesting that Randy Asen had improved the gorge fissure. used it as a dwelling during a documented blizzard, and sheltered 5 people, including a sick child, during a life-threatening emergency. The depot clerk added his signature. The teacher added his. The land office agent, who visited Minnetonka Junction in August, walked to the gorge and looked at the door and the vent and the whitewashed chamber, and wrote in his report that the improvements constituted habitation under the Homestead Act and fell within the boundaries of Randy Assen's 160-acre claim as surveyed. Orrin received a copy of the determination. He put it in his ledger and said nothing about it to anyone. But Orrin was not a man who learned lessons easily, because learning lessons requires admitting that the lesson was needed, and Orrin had built his life on the assumption that what he knew was sufficient. The boundary complaint had been a business strategy. What happened next was something worse. It was imitation without understanding. In November, the barometer dropped fast. The horses turned their tails north. Old-timers went quiet. Orrin, watching the sky, decided that if a breathing cave could shelter 5 people without fuel, then any hole in the ground could do the same, and a man who controlled such a hole would control something more valuable than a woodyard. He knew of an old prospect hole 2 miles east of town, a shaft sunk 10 feet into limestone by a miner who had found nothing and moved on. The hole was dry, the opening was wide, and Orrin assumed that because it was underground, it would behave the way Randy's fissure behaved. He did not test the air. He did not bring a candle. He did not check for moving air, or still air, or bad air. He climbed down the shaft with a lantern and walked 30 feet along a horizontal drift that narrowed as it went, and somewhere in the narrowing the air changed, and he did not notice because he did not know what to notice. He collapsed near the mouth of the drift, not dead, not yet, but the air in the sealed, unventilated prospect hole was carbon poor and heavy with the slow off-gassing of rock that had been closed to the surface for years. The lantern went out first. The flame shrank to a blue point and then disappeared, and Orrin, who had never read a flame in his life, did not understand that the lantern was telling him what his lungs were about to learn. He took 3 more steps in the dark. Then his legs stopped working. He fell forward onto his hands and then onto his face, and his lantern rolled against the wall, and the dark was complete. He lay in the drift for more than an hour before anyone came. Randy found him because she recognized the wrong kind of stillness. She had walked past the prospect hole on her way to check a stand of deadfall timber she planned to cut for next winter's cooking fuel. She noticed the opening, a dark mouth in the hillside with Orrin's cart parked beside it, and his mule standing with its head down in a posture of animal patience that suggested its owner had been gone longer than intended. She looked at the shaft entrance. No vapor, no breath, no faint ribbon of warm air curling upward the way the fissure breathed. The prospect hole was not breathing. It was holding its air the way a jar holds water, sealed, still, unchanging. That stillness was the signal. A breathing cave shows itself. A dead cave shows nothing. She did not enter. She did not crawl into the shaft to check on the man who had mocked her and threatened her children and tried to take her land. She knew what bad air did to people who entered it without preparation, because Aslak had told her, and Aslak had been buried by a cave that was not as dangerous as a cave filled with bad air. She tied a rope to the mule's harness and dropped the other end into the shaft. Then she sent Eli running to town for Ezra. Ezra came with 2 men and a candle on a pole. They lowered the candle into the shaft and watched it gutter blue and die at 8 feet. They waited for the surface breeze to push fresh air into the opening. Randy's instruction, delivered calmly from 20 feet away, and when the candle held steady at 8 feet, they lowered it to 10, and when it held at 10, they sent a man down with the rope tied around his waist, and his breath held and his eyes on the flame. They found Orrin face down in the drift. They dragged him out by his belt. He was breathing, but barely. His lips were blue, and his fingernails were gray, and his pulse, when Ezra pressed 2 fingers to his neck, was thin and fast, the heartbeat of a body that had been starved of air and was trying to compensate with speed. They carried him to the boarding house. He spent 2 days on his back before he could sit upright, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is replaying a mistake and finding no version of it that does not end in the dark. He spent a week before he could walk to his own store. During that week, the settlement talked about what had happened, and the talk was not kind, but it was specific, and specificity is worse than cruelty because it leaves no room for reinterpretation. Orrin Dace had gone into a dead hole without a candle. Randy Asen had known from 20 feet away that the hole was dead. The difference between those 2 facts was the entire argument, and the argument was over. He did not speak to Randy for a month. When he finally did, it was at the store, with no one else present, on a morning when the first snow of the new season was falling quietly outside. He said, "I went into the ground thinking I understood what you had done. I did not understand. You did not find a warm hole. You found a breathing one, and you knew the difference. I found a dead one, and I did not know." Randy said nothing. Orrin said, "She knew the difference between a cave and a grave. I did not." He said it about himself, in the third person, the way a man speaks about a version of himself he would prefer to disown. Then he sold her 2 sacks of flour at cost and did not mention the cave again for the rest of the winter. It was not friendship. It was not respect. It was the grudging, specific acknowledgement of a man who had nearly died from his own ignorance, and who could not pretend, even to himself, that the woman he had mocked was not the reason he was alive to feel ashamed. Nels Haugland arrived in Minnetonka Junction in July of 1888, driving a wagon loaded with carpentry tools and a reputation for honest work that had preceded him from the freight road. He was 37, widowed, quiet in the way that large men are sometimes quiet, not from shyness, but from the understanding that a man his size does not need to be loud to be heard. He had come to rebuild storm-damaged freight wagons for the depot, and the depot foreman had given him a workspace behind the feed barn, and told him the settlement had a surplus of broken wagons and a shortage of men who could fix them properly. Nels heard about the cave the way everyone heard about everything in Minnetonka Junction, through the dense network of gossip, observation, and deliberate information sharing that served as the settlement's newspaper. He heard it first from the depot foreman, who said the widow Asen had survived the January blizzard in a hole in the ground. He heard it second from Ezra Bellows, who corrected the foreman's version with the precision of a man who had been inside the chamber and did not appreciate inaccuracies. He heard it third from Tamsin Pike, who said, "Go see it yourself and stop asking men to describe what a woman built." He went. He walked to the gorge on a Sunday afternoon in August and stood at the fissure mouth and looked at the outer door. He studied it the way a carpenter studies another person's work, not with judgment, but with professional attention, reading the joints and the grain and the way the wood met the stone. He knocked. Randy opened the door. She had never met him. He introduced himself and said he was a carpenter, and he had come to look at the door because he had been told it was unusual, and he was interested in unusual doors. She let him in. He spent